This is the site of Bedford County's very first courthouse. As I mentioned earlier, Bedford County became Bedford County in 1771, 5 years before the American Revolution. In 1774, we finally got around to building a courthouse. Before that, any trials that were held in a tavern. But in 1774, the courthouse was built here. And it wasn't just a courthouse, it had a courtroom, it was the sheriff's office, and it was also the jail in the basement. One of the more interesting trials that I'm going to share with you is about a man named Hieronymus Spangenberg. The only person we've ever executed in our history was this man, and he was a pastor. And here's how the story goes. Spangenberg was a Hessian soldier, a German guy who was brought over by the British to help them fight to put down the revolution. Well, Spangenberg and a lot of the other Hessians, after the British were defeated and getting back on the ships to go back to England, a lot of the Hessians stayed behind. The idea was if you get back on the ships, go over to back to Europe, and you plan to come back here, it would cost you a lot of money to buy a ticket to come back. Well, you know what, Mr. Hessian soldier? You're here now, so why not stay? And a lot of them did. Spangenberg was one of them. And he stayed and settled in a little town called Selinsgrove, Pennsylvania, just north of Harrisburg, PA. Spangenberg wasn't going to be a soldier anymore, so he was hired as the assistant pastor of the German Reformed Church. Some time went by. Spangenberg began seeing a young lady, and one day a maid cleaning his apartment found a letter from Spangenberg's wife and kids in the old country who had tracked him down. You see, Spangenberg had just abandoned his family. He left them there. Because you know what? He was here, he liked it here. If you go back, he just wouldn't have had the money to go back to Europe, get him, and come back. He liked his life here. So here's a guy that they didn't think much of. They threw him out of town. And he fled west to the frontier, which was here. In Bedford County, he found a home because people didn't know who he was yet. He seemed to know what he was talking about, so he was hired as the pastor of the German Reformed Church here. There were a lot of Germans. The German Reformed Church, by the way, is a forerunner to the United Church of Christ. 1 block from this location is our United Church of Christ. So Spangenberg is hired for the German Reformed Church. He has several charges, which means he preaches at a church here, one in Berlin, Pennsylvania, part of Bedford County, and also one in Huntington, Pennsylvania, also at that time, part of Bedford County. A man named Jacob Glessner moves his family west. Jacob Glessner from Selinsgrove, Pennsylvania, and settles in a town named Berlin, PA, one of Spangenberg's charges. Sitting in church, he thinks to himself, gosh, that pastor looks awfully familiar. And he stands up in the middle of the church service and announces to everybody that he knows who their pastor is. And he tells them the story about how they threw him out of Selinsgrove because he had abandoned his family. And now, since he's married here, that makes him a bigamist. Well, that might have been an interesting day to be in church. The elders called a meeting, and they asked Jacob Glessner to offer testimony, and also Reverend Spangenberg. During the testimony, that elders meeting, Spangenberg and Glessner got into a pretty heated argument. Reverend Spangenberg pulled a knife out of his black pastorly robe and stabbed Glessner and killed him right there in the church. The elders jumped on top of Spangenberg, subdued him, and brought him here for trial to the Bedford County Courthouse. He wasn't found guilty of bigamy, but he was found guilty of murder, and they still frowned on that back then. And Spangenberg was hanged for his crime right about the spot where the man on the monument stands today. So the new pastors that come into the area even today, we like to welcome them to the area, thank them for being here, and remind them that we're not afraid to do it if necessary, the new pastors. So, a little story. I tell you what, we're going to make our next stop, and it's right behind where I'm at right now. If you'll just follow me back, you'll see a little sign that says Lutheran Parish, and I want us to stand in front of that door. So follow me, if you would, to the front of the Lutheran Parish, maybe 20 yards back. Come on.